Even today, years after the terrible event, I cannot take in that Reggie murdered McVitie. Yes, he could be violent, but, unlike Ronnie, he had always held back. Much was made at the trial of Ronnie's alleged comment, "I've done mine. Now you do yours." I do not know whether he did say it because neither twin will discuss it with me. They did not volunteer information at the time, and when I've brought it up since then, they can't understand why I'm interested in something that happened so long ago. They say, "What difference will it make if we tell you?" To me, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing Ronnie would have said. He'd always been more inclined to do things himself. One thing is certain, if Francis had not died, Reggie would not have committed that crime, spurred on by a death wish. If Francis had been alive, and they were living a happy married life, with children perhaps, he would have been a different person. When guns had come on the scene he would have thought it through and seen the sense in getting out. As it was, Francis met a tragic end and Reggie lost all interest in life, becoming just like all the others. When those idiots who called themselves friends egged Ronnie on that Saturday night, the lethal cocktail of drinks and drugs helped Reggie enjoy it all as much as everyone else, and he was to pay the price. Despite all the prosecution lies, all the inadmissible evidence, and my own barrister's reluctance to put me on the witness stand, I still believe I would have been cleared, or at least received a far lighter sentence, had it not been for Melford Stevenson. Before the case, police and lawyers alike were saying that he was the worst possible choice for the men on trial, and I was to find this hard to dispute as the hearing went on and on. It was not just the words he used, it was his tone and mannerisms, his tut-tutting and sarcastic comments that were quite obviously designed to leave the jury in no doubt what he felt about a particular witness's evidence. The transcript of the hearing does not tell the full story. If it had been taped and filmed, one would be able to see how Stevenson swayed the evidence in the prosecution's favor and then meted out the unbelievably harsh sentences that appeased his pals in high places, but shocked nearly everyone else. The small things drove me and the twins mad, the way Stevenson treated our Aunt May, for instance. May had never been in a court in her life, and was married to a man who had worked in the same company for 50 years and was so straight that he'd never even been given a parking ticket. She was a religious woman who went to church regularly, but Stevenson treated her abominably with a total lack of respect just because she was speaking on behalf of the twins. In contrast, Ronnie Hart's girlfriend was treated like a lady by Stevenson. It really wound us up, but there was nothing we could do, except sit there and take it. We took it for 39 days, days in which the smooth, efficient, well-rehearsed case against the twins, their firm and me rolled on and on to its inevitable conclusion. Many days were filled with legal mumbo-jumbo which I found hard to follow, others were filled with stories of the twins' reign of terror, which I found equally hard to swallow. But there were moments of humor too, like Ronnie's comment when he was charged with being involved in the McVitie murder. Warned by Nipper Reed that anything he said would be taken down and might be used in evidence against him, Ronnie replied, "I presume that your presumptions are precisely incorrect and that your sarcastic insinuations are too obnoxious to be appreciated." As he watched a fellow detective write it on the charge sheet, Ronnie added, "Bit hard to spell that one, isn't it?" I'm not sure what the elaborately worded sentence meant, but Ronnie liked the sound of it as a child and had learned it parrot fashion. He said it to the police because he didn't give a damn. He was obviously philosophical, he always thought he'd get 30 years. His cheeky answer to the charge had to be read out at the Old Bailey, of course, and provided welcome light relief to the heaviness of the proceedings. I think the laughter in court even woke Ronnie up. If there was going to be any humor, even black humor, it was bound to come from Ronnie. And he made me smile one day when he more or less ordered the judge to let him give evidence after making it clear to defense and prosecution counsels that he would not. Ian Barry, charged as an accessory in the blind beggar killing, had just stepped down from the witness box and Ronnie suddenly said loudly, "I'm going to give evidence now." Some bigwig, probably the judge, told him it was most irregular. Ronnie had chosen not to testify and had instructed his counsel, Paul Wrightson, accordingly. That cut no ice whatsoever with Ronnie. "I can change my mind if I like," he said. "I want to give evidence, and I'm going to, it's my right." I couldn't help smiling at the turmoil he caused. Courts, naturally, have set rules of procedure and officials don't like the protocol being upset. But Ronnie couldn't have cared less. Once he decided to do something he usually did it. He got his way that day, and the court buzzed with expectancy as he took the stand. Prosecution counsel, Kenneth Jones, a little Welshman with a resounding Richard Burton-type voice that seemed too big for his body, couldn't believe his luck. He tore into Ronnie with relish, determined to goad him into losing his temper and perhaps betray signs of the violence that was an integral part of the prosecution case. Much to the eloquent Mr. Jones's chagrin, Ronnie was far from intimidated by his cultured tones and cunning approach. He was in the mood to antagonize everyone, and he matched Jones's skill with a cheeky arrogance. "Among your firm, you are known as the Colonel?" asked Mr. Jones. "I was a deserter from the army, so how could I be a colonel?" Ronnie replied. "You gave money to charity," Mr. Jones said later. "Is that a terrible thing?" Ronnie asked. "There are stories that it might have been £10,000. Where did you get that money from?" "I don't think that matters," Ronnie countered. "I hid it. That's all that matters." When that didn't seem to satisfy his interrogator, Ronnie shouted, "If you want to know, my father gambles for me. He's up there in the gallery, so ask him. I know nothing about gambling, so there's no point in asking me. I may have clubs, but I know nothing about gambling." The judge broke in to tell Ronnie not to shout. But Ronnie just said, "Why? I'm here to speak. And I'm answering." Jones went on, and finally Ronnie had had enough. "Listen, you fat slob," he said, making me cringe. "You've been going on enough. You're Welsh, aren't you? Down the mines would have been a more fitting profession for you than being a prosecutor, I promise you that." Naturally, this attitude did not endear him to the judge or jury, but Ronnie was convinced, as ever, that he was going to get 30 years, innocent or guilty, and he didn't care. It had just come into his head that he wanted to say something, so he said it. Something Ronnie did not say, however, despite my encouragement to do so, was what his so-called pals, particularly Hart and Albert Donahue, had got up to during the twins' so-called reign of terror. These two supposedly tough individuals loved the villainy. Late one night they got drunk, forced their way into the Regency Club and demanded £50 a week from the owner Johnny Berry. The next day, having sobered up, they were worried and went to Ronnie to own up. He went spare, wanting to know why they had done that when the firm had a share in the club anyway. Hart and Donahue admitted they had made a mistake but begged Ronnie to say he'd sent them round because Berry might get the police involved. Typically, Ronnie helped them. He told Berry he had the hump the previous night and had sent Hart and Donahue round. He said he was sorry and asked Berry to forget it. To my disappointment, Ronnie didn't tell that story in court. Nor did he tell how Hart and Donahue went to Freddie Foreman's pub and tried to nip him for £25. When I asked him why he hadn't seized the chance to redress the balance that was swinging ever more heavily against us all, he said that nothing would ever make him sink as low as those rats. He had his principles and he would stick to them. But I know he was sick to the stomach over a blatant lie Donahue told the police when he was trying to get himself off the hook in the McVitie case. During a meeting with Donahue and our solicitors, shortly after the arrests, Ronnie asked for the address of Donahue's mother, saying he wanted to send someone round with some money for her. It was a genuine offer of help, but when Donahue turned Queen's evidence he twisted the story to put Ronnie in a bad light, claiming that Ronnie wanted the address because he was going to arrange for the old lady to be murdered. In those days, Ronnie seldom worried about anything, but that allegation hurt him. Set up an old woman to be wiped out. Ronnie used to get the hump if anyone even swore in front of women. But when his chance came to hit back against Donahue he still chose not to. I never found out whether that lie was Donahue's idea or the police's. Certainly Nipper Reed and his team weren't fussy about the tactics they used to blacken our names and reputations. The disgraceful lie about Reggie and Connie Whitehead's son, for example, takes some beating. Reggie idolized Connie Whitehead's little boy, also named Connie, and used to take him to a boys' club to see Father Hetherington. When the balloon went up, Whitehead tried to get himself out of trouble by writing a letter to the police saying that Reggie had threatened his wife and son. Our solicitor heard of the allegations and told the twins, but made them promise not to touch Whitehead. It was very hard for them because Reggie had stayed with the Whiteheads and had done nothing but try to help them. Ronnie seemed even more wound up about the lie than Reggie, and when he saw Whitehead in jail he said, "I see. You wrote to old Bill and said Reggie threatened your wife and kid." Connie had no idea the twins knew and he went white, fearing the worst. Ronnie would have broken Connie in half if he hadn't promised to tell the truth. Connie did admit in court that the police had made him say it, but as far as the twins and myself were concerned, that did not make things right. What sort of man agrees to utter such a lie to make things easier for himself? Most of the courtroom battles were, of course, won by the prosecution, but Reggie did score a couple of victories which, although they did not affect the outcome of the cases, did give him some satisfaction. One was when Kenneth Jones brought up Francis. Reggie immediately got to his feet, his face white with fury. He was gripping the rail round the dock so tightly I thought he was going to break it. What has Francis to do with this case, he demanded to know. Jones made an attempt to justify bringing up her name, but Reggie interrupted him. This has nothing to do with her, he said. Then he added, quietly but menacingly, if you continue involving her name, I'll be over this dock to you. I know all the police here are armed, but no gun will stop me. Reggie thought Jones was going to bring up Francis' suicide to make him look bad. So did the rest of us in the dock, and we all stood up to support Reggie's objection. It was like a scene from a film. For several tense seconds, Jones and Reggie glared at each other. Then the barrister gulped and said to the judge, who was also shaken by Reggie's fury, in view of the circumstances, my lord, I think we'll move on to another subject. It proved the point, I think, that Jones was out of order in mentioning Francis. If he had been right, surely he would have insisted on carrying on, despite Reggie's threat. The longer the trial went on, the more the jury were swayed by Stevenson's interjections, the less confident I became that I would be found not guilty. All the signs pointed to the lies triumphing over the truth. My fears proved well-founded on Tuesday, 4th of March, when the jury returned after 7 hours deliberation to find myself and everyone else in the dock guilty of their respective crimes. Sentencing was put off until the next day, probably to prolong the agony, and the twins, their firm and I were taken back to Brixton to think about what sentences we would get. Ronnie was still philosophical about it. 30 years was what he expected. Reggie was now thinking the same. And me? Well, all I prayed was that Stevenson, despite his biased performance throughout the whole 39 days and particularly in his summing up, would see my position for what it was and treat me leniently. Many of the Brixton prison staff who believed in my innocence kept telling me I'd get no more than 2 years, and much as I hated the idea of doing any time at all for something I didn't do, I hoped they were right. With remission for good behavior, that would be down to about 18 months, and since I'd been in custody for a year that would mean I'd be out in 6 months or so. I was far from happy at the prospect of spending more time behind bars, but I wasn't in the depths of despair. I finally dropped off to sleep, having convinced myself that even if Stevenson did his worst I could reasonably expect nothing more than 3 years. I take it on the chin, make sure I kept my nose clean in prison, then pick up my life where I'd left off. When we arrived at the Old Bailey the next morning, one of the officers in the cells offered me a bottle with some liquid in it. It was a tranquilizer to calm me down and he wanted me to take it before I went into the dock. No thanks, I said. I'm quite capable of accepting anything Stevenson dishes out. Other officers pressed me to take some, but I still couldn't see the point. Then Ronnie urged me to take it to keep everyone happy, so I did. I can't say for certain what that odd-smelling mixture did to me. I did feel a bit strange, but then the whole experience had been strange, like a disturbing dream where all sorts of people pop up in the unlikeliest places, saying and doing the craziest things, where one minute everything is clear and certainly happening, and the next, it's fuzzy like your imagination, and then you finally awake, not knowing where you are, and you can't tell the things that happened from the things that didn't. I was sitting in my cell in a sort of trance, when one of the officers came by. Charlie, he called quietly, they've got 30 years. I stared at him, the dream focusing sharply into reality. 30 years. It was what they had expected, what they had prepared themselves for. But it was still dreadful to hear. My twin brothers were to be caged until they were old-age pensioners, banished from the outside world until just 1 year from the end of the 20th century. It was hard to take in, and the officer's face and words began to fade behind a cloud of unreality. Then I was floating, and the next thing I knew I was standing in the dock looking at Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson, feeling the heavy silence of the crowded court but not sure whether I was really there. Then the judge was speaking, not so much to me, but at me, relating incidents about my past that I'd long forgotten. I listened, trying to take in what he was saying, but it was as though he was talking about someone else, someone I'd known very well but hadn't seen for years, perhaps someone from another life. He spoke for only a minute or so, but it seemed like forever, and then he got to the point of his monologue, the denouement of my personal tragedy that had been played out on the greatest criminal stage in the land. Charles James Kray, he said slowly, you have been found guilty of being an accessory to murder. It may well be that you were not a member of what in this case has been called the firm, but I am satisfied that you were an active and willing helper in the dreadful enterprise of concealing traces of the murder committed by your brother. Stevenson paused. He looked down at Kenneth Jones. For accessory after the fact, the maximum sentence, I believe, is. My breath caught in my throat. I could see the word forming in his mouth, grotesquely enlarged like some surrealistic painting. Was this all happening, or was it a dream? Was I here? Or was someone pretending to be me? And then he said it, and I swear my heart stopped. Life. Jones sprang to his feet. No, m'lud, he corrected. The law has been changed. The maximum sentence for accessory after the fact is 10 years. And I don't wish, then my heart pounded. Don't wish with Mr. Jones? Say it. Go on, tell him you don't wish to press for the maximum sentence. Tell him you don't believe all the lies, nor do you wish for a man to get 10 years for something he didn't do. Go on, Mr. Jones, tell him. But the judge was motioning to him to sit down. That's enough, Mr. Jones, he snapped. And he turned to me. I sentence you to 10 years imprisonment. I stared at him, suddenly understanding, even in my dreamlike state, the meaning of the phrase absolute power. Take that man down. The words seemed to come from a long way off, and I was floating again, and the next thing I heard was Ronnie banging on the door of the first cell, asking what had happened. I got 10 years, I said. Ronnie went mad. He started kicking the door, then he began shouting. 10 years. The rats gave you 10 years. There wasn't much else one could say. I was taken to my cell, where I sat, saying over and over in my mind, 10 years. 10 years. 10 fucking years. Then Freddie Foreman and Connie Whitehead were put in the cell with me. Freddie had got 10 years for supposedly disposing of McVitie's body. Connie had got 9, 2 for having a gun and 7 for complicity in the McVitie murder. I could hear Ronnie still creating in his cell. An officer passed by and motioned towards the first cell. He's making more fuss over your 10 than his 30, he said. Shortly afterwards the officer came back. Charlie, he said. Ian Barry's got 20 years. He's in a state. I can't pull him out of it. Can you have the word and try to calm him down? I did my best. I told him I was sorry, but he had to calm down. There was an appeal coming up, his sentence was bound to be reduced. I didn't really believe it, but it was all I could think of to quieten him down. Hope was all I could offer. When I went back to my cell, Connie was sobbing. 9 years, he kept saying. Connie, I said as gently as I could, trying to hide my irritation, Freddie and me have got 10 years for doing nothing. How do you think we feel? I sat down on the cell bed and put my head in my hands. Reality was forcing through the numbness as the effects of the tranquilizer began to wear off, and I found myself trying to get to grips with what 10 years meant. I was coming up to 43 years old. Even with full remission, I was going to be more or less 50 when I came out. I looked at Freddie. What had happened to bring us here? What hand of fate had decided to make us the fall guys? Why us? With the daunting prospect of spending vital middle-aged years incarcerated behind bars hitting home to me now, I was at my lowest ebb, frail and weak from nearly a year in custody, drained dry from hearing my reputation blackened in 39 dizzy days of courtroom drama. And then the cell door opened and my solicitor Ralph Haines walked in. Detectives Red and Kate were upstairs and they wanted to see me, he said. My heart leapt. Maybe, I thought, they were shocked at the severity of my sentence, maybe they were going to make a submission for it to be reduced. Crazy thoughts, I know, but I was so low I was ready to clutch at any straw. I looked at Ralph hopefully, but his face was grim. What do they want to see me for? Ralph looked down, shamefaced and embarrassed. They're going to charge you again with the murder of Frank Mitchell. I froze. 10 years for something I hadn't done was terrible enough. But to face a life sentence for a murder I had nothing to do with. The previous summer the murder charge against me had been dropped through lack of evidence without the case going to trial. But since then a law known as a voluntary bill of indictment had been passed, which meant that I could be charged again. The new legislation made it possible for the prosecution to put the accused straight before a judge and jury without bothering with committal proceedings in a lower court. I looked at Reed and Cater with contempt, but they couldn't bring themselves to look at me. They knew full well I had had nothing to do with Mitchell's murder. They charged me and asked if I had anything to say, but I said nothing. What was there to say? That night in Brixton, I learned from prison staff that it was common knowledge in the NIC that the police were determined to stitch me up on the Mitchell case. They had not liked the charge against me being dropped at Bow Street the previous July. I ached with despair. Was there no end to the police vendetta? Wasn't 10 years enough? Did they really want me to go away for a lifetime too? I was standing on a chair in the security wing looking out of the window when Tommy Cowley called up from the remand block below. "Charlie, I know how bad you feel. But there's no way you can be found guilty on this Mitchell thing." I grunted sarcastically. "You all said they wouldn't be able to get me in the McVitie trial, but I ended up with 10 years, so please don't say anything now." Tommy simply repeated that I couldn't possibly be found guilty. I thanked him for trying to make me feel better, and I hoped he was right, but I felt it was a useless, stupid thing to say. If the police wanted to get someone, they had plenty of ways of doing it. I had learned my lesson from the Bow Street hearing, and I was going into the witness box, come what may, to say my piece. I had nothing to lose. At the committal proceedings I'd listened to Bowden's advice and it had rebounded on me. By not going into the witness box I'd left myself open to all sorts of allegations which could, because of my silence, must have been believed. The most outrageous of these, which would have been funny in less dire circumstances, concerned Leslie Payne's accountant friend, Freddie Gore, whom the twins and I had had some dealings with during the Great African Safari. The only harsh encounter I'd had with Gore had been when he walked into an office I shared with Payne in Great Portland Street and interrupted a conversation we were having. I didn't approve of his manners, but let it pass. About 10 minutes later, however, he came back and did the same thing. "Mr. Gore," I said angrily, "don't do that to me again. It's an insult. Remember, you work here and can be sacked. If you must say something privately, do it outside." After our arrests, when they were holding us on all sorts of weird and wonderful charges, Gore walked into the witness box at Bow Street and was asked by the prosecution, "Have you ever been threatened by anyone?" "Yes, one person," Gore replied. "Don't you see the person anywhere in this court?" Gore looked at the twins and me and the others in the dock and pointed. I looked around to see who he was pointing at, but Ronnie nudged me and whispered, "He means you." Shocked, I stood up. "I threaten you?" I said. "I've never threatened you in my life." During the lunchtime adjournment I told Bowden about the incident in the office, the only time I'd said anything remotely harsh to Gore, and said I wanted to go into the witness box to set the record straight. Bowden would not hear of it. "Don't worry," he said. "Wait till we get to the Old Bailey. We'll get him there. But at least ask him how I was supposed to have threatened him," I pleaded. Bowden would not budge. He did not want to commit himself, he said, in case we gave something away that might be useful to the prosecution. I argued with him. Since there were no reporting restrictions, Gore's allegation was going to be all over the papers, with no response at all from me. To people who didn't know me, it would look as though I was admitting the threat, and I was sure that would be bad for my case. But Bowden told me I must be guided by him in matters of law, so unswallowed it. The next day, the papers made a meal of it. "Gang boss threatens witness," screamed the headlines. Nice. I was choked, and I couldn't resist asking Bowden if he'd seen the papers. "Unfortunately, I have," he replied, embarrassed. When I appeared at the Old Bailey on the McVitie charge, Bowden was again against my going into the box, repeating that if I didn't say anything, nothing could be used against me. My gut reaction said he was wrong, but I went along with him because he was the legal expert. As it was, the decision not to give evidence was disastrous for me. In his summing up, Melford Stevenson made an issue of it, saying, if Charles Kray was innocent, would he not have gone into the witness box? He made it look as if I had made the decision not to give evidence. Afterwards, I told Bowden I'd been made to look an idiot. He tried to console me by saying that it did not matter, and that Stevenson should not have said what he did. Sadly, that didn't do much for me. Barristers are very highly trained, but they are not very worldly. I don't think Bowden was got at, either at Bow Street or at the Old Bailey, but I do think he gave me bad advice, albeit in good faith, in a case that was to ruin my life. So So when the Mitchell trial opened at the Old Bailey in April 1969, I made the point strongly to Bowden, I was not going to be set up twice, I was going into the box, come what may. And I did. I'm sure that giving evidence helped me, particularly since the judge Mr. Justice Lawton was fair-minded, totally aware of what was going on and unlike Stevenson, eager to see that justice was done. For example, when the prosecution counsel, Kenneth Jones again, tried to belittle me over my earnings as a theatrical agent, Lawton stepped in to let everyone know what was right. Jones, who obviously knew nothing about the theatrical agency business, implied that I was trying to cover something up concerning a bank statement, which the judge then asked to see. Within seconds he said the statement was in order and he understood it perfectly. Jones was angry at being put in his place and tried to take it out on me. He quoted 5 people who had given a different version of events from the one I had sworn, and said, Come Mr. Kray, what reason do you give for their telling lies? All 5 of them? That's quite simple, I said. Oh, is it? Jones replied. Why is that? Because they are sitting there and I am standing here, I said. He did not have an answer to that. I sensed the judge nodding in agreement. He seemed to be aware of who was telling the truth, unlike Stevenson, whose preoccupation, it seemed, was to find people guilty. Lawton appreciated very early in the trial that the case against me was extremely slim. One particular piece of evidence, concerning where I had been on 2 days in December in 1966, was vital, and thankfully I was able to prove that I was not where the police said I was because I was at home in bed with Quincy. Fortunately, a Dr. Morris, a child psychiatrist with a practice in Wimpole Street, came to my home to visit my son Gary, who he was treating for suspected rheumatic fever, and he wrote to the court confirming I had been in bed. Lawton told the jury that a letter from such a professional gentleman should be accepted, and from then on I was home and dry. It was the judge who actually led the prosecution into dropping its case against me. After hearing all the evidence, he ordered the jury to leave the court while he had a discussion with Kenneth Jones. Regarding Mr. Charles Kray, said the judge, 4 people have testified that he was at a meeting to kill Frank Mitchell. A lot of things have been said at this trial, but let us say they were right. He was there and they all discussed it. He could have said no thank you, I want nothing to do with it. Because we don't hear very much about Charles Kray afterwards, do we? Whatever they say, it is not very safe at all, is it? Mr. Jones agreed it wasn't. Do you want to carry on with the case against him? Asked the judge. No, my lord. Then I'm stopping the case against Mr. Kray, said the judge. And in the dock I found myself weeping with relief. I was too caught up in the emotion of the moment to be embarrassed or ashamed of my tears. Anyone who has been in a major court, fighting to prove their innocence, will appreciate my feelings. The relief was indescribable, and at last I felt that the nightmare of the Axeman was over. I was wrong. The police, not satisfied with my 10-year sentence in the McVitie case, had another card up their sleeves. If I didn't actually help to murder poor Frank Mitchell, they argued, then I had helped plot his escape from Dartmoor and had harbored him in London. More rubbish, of course. But more agony, too. I was beginning to feel that their persecution was endless. Thankfully, this case was eventually thrown out too, but not before I'd been reduced to tears again in the witness box. Fueled by more and more lies from Albert Donahue, Billy Exley, and Harry Hopwood, the persistent prosecutor hammered away at me, insisting that I must have known about the arrangements for springing Mitchell. I took it for what seemed an age, and then the terrible injustice of having to defend myself against lying idiots finally got to me, overwhelming me, and I cracked. Trembling with emotion, I said, I didn't have anything to do with it. They did. You have to remember, my name is Kray, and if anyone makes a statement and puts the name Kray on it, they are believed by the police. I gripped the frame of the witness box tightly as I felt my voice going. I fought in vain to control it. I'm doing 10 years for nothing because of all these lies, I choked. As I wept again with the frustration and injustice of it all, Mr. Justice Lawton adjourned the court. The high tension of the Old Bailey saps one's energy. Adrenaline starts to flow as soon as the building comes into sight. I had had more than 300 tortuous hours which had done my brain in, leaving me mentally drained and ragged, my nerves in tatters. When they finally took me back to Brixton and opened my cell, I walked in with my shoulders hunched in dejection, what little pride I clung to in court all gone. I fell on the bed and curled myself into a tight ball, enjoying the silence and the solitude. I think then I knew how a fox feels when he finally shakes off the hounds.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.